Nicholas, best beans, best roast, best coffee.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. We're coming to you live from Matrix Design in Bartlett, part of our AM 560 Signature Bank business tour. We spoke to the principal, Pat Birchie, at the bottom of last hour. Very interesting discussion about automation and robots, particularly as something the left is demagoguing as it pertains to the future job opportunities for millennials and the like. Andrew Yang, yesterday making that part of his pitch to a bunch of aspiring tech entrepreneurs in San Francisco.
Yes, in between kissing babies, and he had 3,000 people show up for his event and has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars so far.
It's more than 60,000 donors, more than 360 grand so far. So, it's one of these people that may catch fire and have an impact on the race. Who knows? Two others that have yet to catch fire have an impact on the race. Elizabeth Warren, Kristen Gillibrand competing town halls. Gillibrand on MSNBC, Warren on CNN. I'm not surprised, okay? I'm not surprised when Elizabeth Warren turns her back on the 12th Amendment and Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution and calls for the elimination of the Electoral College because the left didn't like the 2016 presidential outcome. I'm not surprised. But I am a little bit surprised when a conservative like Devin Nunes starts down a path, this is a civil action, but starts down a path that has a sort of a different way to go after big tech than Warren is proposing, which just is through antitrust. Devin Nunes announcing yesterday a $250 million lawsuit against Twitter, and here's him explaining the basis for his suit on Hannity last night.
Yeah, so this is the first of many, Sean, and what we're doing here is we're actually going after Twitter first because they are the main proliferator and they spread this fake news and the slanderous news. So if you look at the lawsuit, I think at night people can go and look at it on Fox News, it's all there. But the case we're basically making is this was an orchestrated effort. So people were targeting me. There were anonymous accounts that were developed. And look, there's not supposed to be, these accounts aren't supposed to exist. Twitter says that they don't have accounts that do this. So like I said, this is the first of many lawsuits that are coming, but there were several fake news accounts, whether it was regard to the Russia investigation or to me. And we have to hold all of these people accountable because if we don't, our First Amendment rights are at stake here. This isn't 20 years ago, Sean. What's happening is that Twitter becomes the gaslighting for all of the news. And when they're regulating us, they're regulating what people can see on my tweets, which they've done, and then they're proliferating out things that they agree with the algorithms that they develop. They need to come clean. They're not a public square. They are content developers.
So that's the distinction Nunes makes in his lawsuit. They're content developers. They're not just a forum. They're not just a public square. The lawsuit alleges defamation, but what it sounds like Nunes is arguing is access. They, shadow ban his tweets and promote the tweets of algorithmic bots that attack him and so forth.
Yeah, they're, parody tweets. Like one is Devin Nunes' mom, which says, come home right now, no more Minecraft. I mean, they're just parody accounts.
But access to a private square is not constitutionally protected. So I'm not clear exactly, and particularly the high standard that a public official has to make out a defamation claim. I'm not persuaded at all by Nunes' suit, and I don't know that he's persuaded by it in terms of its viability. I think he's persuaded to approach Twitter through the courts for the purposes of trying to institute some discipline. Which I find also problematic coming from a former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Noah Rothman, who is the associate editor for Commentary. He's also the author of the new book, Unjust, Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. Noah, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
How did you receive Nunes' lawsuit and the argument that provides the basis for it?
I am very perplexed by what the clip you just played. I didn't understand a word of it, frankly. It struck me as like a lot of word salad. There was an effort there to make some sort of a self-justification, but it was approximating legal language. There wasn't anything that would fly in a court. A judge would look at you and with one eye sort of poking out of his head. It was just very strange. The suit itself, I'm not even sure if it was filed in a court as of last night. What was published on Fox News came probably from his office. There were no markings on it distinctive of it being filed in a local court. I'm sure he will, but I don't believe it had been at the time. I'm suggesting that there was a lot of publicity there. You talked about some of the efforts to demonstrate standing here, which seem pretty just debatable at the very least and really spurious at most. He's talking about abuse hurled at him by anonymous accounts. The notion that Twitter is responsible for this would delegate them as a publisher and subject them to regulation, and they're not a publisher. If we are going to define them as such, it would open them to antitrust regulation and also regulation associated with speech. But I don't think that's a much bigger debate, and it's something that I don't think we're having here. And one of the claims in his suit that is of particular consternation to me is this quote in paragraph 35, quote, "The ability to use Twitter is a vital part of modern citizenship," unquote. Further, Twitter is essential for an individual, ellipses, to engage in a level of political organizing in America. Really? Really, though? I mean, God help us if that's true. Because then we're creating the notion here that this is some sort of a vital element of American political participation, subject to all sorts of regulatory efforts to ensure maximum participation in that forum. And then we're not talking about a private company anymore. It's something that's virtually part of the American fabric. It's virtually a governing organization that needs to be regulated as such as though it were a national entity, a utility even. This is sort of the language that we talk about from the left. This begins to sound a lot more like Elizabeth Warren than anything very conservative. So
Yeah,
I'm very confused as to the whole basis of the suit.
Yeah, and whether he likes it or not, he's a public figure, and there's going to be parody accounts, such as Devin Nunes' mom and Devin Nunes' cow. But he does believe that the First Amendment rights are at stake here. Anything to agree with that?
Not really. The First Amendment protects Americans from infringement by the state, the government, as it were, state and federal government and local government can't infringe on your capacity to engage in free association and discourse and freedom of religion and what have you. This is a private company, again, as we're talking about. You have no constitutional right to access these platforms. It doesn't exist. You sort of look at the Constitution as though it were a civic religion, which I appreciate, and I am very much a participant in it. And I think we have an absolutist, maximalist view of free speech that sort of begins to constitute these private realms, and that's good. But it's not what the Article 1 or the First Amendment of the Constitution protects. It's just not. It's a very different thing. Private enterprise, private spaces are different from public space.
And it seems to me what people are sort of arguing is a social mores argument, a influence argument. Well, Twitter, First Amendment may be a negative restraint on government, but Twitter is more powerful than the government. There's more people there. You can do more things or have more influence by leveraging Twitter to raise money or to distribute a message. Well, so what? That's not the point, and that's not the restraint. The restraint is on the institution that has a monopoly of force in society. That's what distinguishes it from Twitter, no matter how popular or how much Twitter could be leveraged for political influence.
And what's the principle there? Are we talking about just the number of people who are on it? Because Facebook is by orders of magnitude larger. And are we just talking about a certain population threshold on these platforms? Does Pinterest not meet that threshold, or Instagram? Right. We're really talking about going down some sort of a very subjective dialogue that I don't think has any sort of limiting principle to it. And because of the nature of this lawsuit and what is being alleged here, and the fact that it wasn't even filed in a court before it made it on television, strikes me as a publicity play.
I want to switch gears and get your handicapping on the race for the Democrat nomination to this point. It seems to me, get your reaction to this, that what you have right now is setting up pretty nicely for Kamala Harris because of the focus on Biden and Beto and Bernie. A lot of attacks coming from the left, particularly as it pertains to Beto and to some extent Biden, and then some, like Ezekiel Emanuel writing in The Atlantic, going after Bernie because I think they're afraid that Bernie gets too much traction. And so do we have an opportunity for someone like Kamala Harris, who's probably the only other candidate that gets to the threshold level of money required to make the distance, to run right up the middle?
Yeah, I think she's probably the best positioned progressive in the race. It's a pretty crowded field on the left side of the spectrum, but she's got a lot of energy and momentum and fundraising behind her. I'm not sure what lanes are a weird way to think about this, as though they occupy these particular pathways to the nomination, appealing to a very distinct subset of voters. It's sort of a bad way to think about it, but nevertheless, it's a helpful way to think about it. And I'm not sure what lane Beto occupies, really, because he's kind of presenting himself as this appealing centrist moderate, but he has some progressive positions. He's got star power, and star power can't be dismissed. But that's really his claim here, and Biden seems to occupy this moderate part of the spectrum. So, I mean, if it really comes down to it, you have a pretty well-represented field in those three candidates, and to the extent that a Beto would cannibalize the vote that would never be available to Kamala Harris, then Kamala Harris is better positioned. Her real competition comes from Bernie Sanders, who, frustrating to the left though it may be, is the front runner at this very early point in time.
Absolutely.
He's got the crowd, he's got the donors, small dollar donors. He's leading in the polls in these early states. So, as irritating as it is for Democrats, because, very familiar to the Donald Trump dynamic in 2016, he's not even really a member of the party. He has no filter. He's kind of embarrassing. That he's nevertheless the most powerful person in this race, and the anti-establishment sentiment that overtook the Republican Party in 2016 hasn't abated, and it looks set to overtake the Democrats in 2020.
But don't you think it says something that Beto was able to raise $6.1 million in less than 24 hours? I mean, that says
Absolutely.
something.
I just don't know what it says. It could mean that he's got a lot of appeal among the Democratic electorate. It could mean that he just has a really great list from 2018, which is, I suspect, what Bernie Sanders was able to generate the amount of money that he did in that first 24 hours too, because he had a really strong national list that he could tap into for those early dollar donations. And Kamala Harris didn't really have a national list, but Beto sure did. So, it's probably a combination of those two things. He's got star power. He's got Oprah behind him. He's a very interesting guy, and Democrats like him a lot. But he also had this built-in infrastructure from 2018 that he could tap into, and that contributed to it.
I wanted to get your reaction to a particular aspect of the terrible shooting in Utrecht yesterday, where 3 people were killed, murdered, and now 3 people are in custody. One, a Turkish national, who's alleged to be the shooter. The Dutch authorities saying probably a terrorist attack, but there may be other motives, so they haven't said that definitively, at least the last that I've heard. But something that the response from the Dutch government in the early moments after the shooting, the university closed its buildings, trains were not allowed to run the city station, and paramilitary police were posted to airports and mosques. Airports and mosques, not churches, not synagogues, mosques. Now, I mean, this was a country who saw Theo van Gogh murdered on their streets by an Islamic extremist some 15 years ago. And, of course, we know of other significant Islamic terrorist attacks in Western Europe. And I get against the backdrop of what happened in New Zealand, but do you take that at all as curious or problematic that that the paramilitary police sent to mosques as the singular religious institution to protect, or institutions?
Not especially. I'm disinclined to second guess the thoughts and provisions employed by law enforcement. They know more than I do about this particular threat on the ground. I'm disinclined to question that judgment. And as you said, coming on the heels of what occurred in New Zealand, and the prospects for some sort of a potential backlash, it's understandable, and it's certainly something that is up for debate. But I can understand where that's coming from, and every precaution in these moments is certainly necessary and valid. Probably universal extension of those protections, as you say, would have been equally valid, but I don't see this as prejudicial.
All right. He is Noah Rothman. He is the associate editor for Commentary Magazine. His book, Unjust, Social Justice and the Unmasking of America. Noah, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And he joined us on our Turnkey.pro answer line.
It's like a hot, steaming cup of information to start your day. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM